All right, as people are trickling in, let me also take this opportunity to welcome everyone. Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you so much for taking your time to join this webinar this afternoon. Please feel free to get comfortable, settle in. You can share your name and the organization that you're representing would like to know. Also, you can share this, the location from where you are joining us from. It is always interesting to find out how far and wide our community can reach. So do feel free to share all those details. Oh yes, colleagues, you can also share things that you are hoping to learn today. I believe that's another great way to connect with other participants who might have similar interests. So don't hold back. Feel free to share what you're looking forward to learn today. Perhaps in our next installment, we might cover those areas if they are not covered today. I don't see anything on the chat yet. Well, I think it's 1 minute past 5 now. We're supposed to start at 5, perhaps. If you can allow 1 minute or two for those last minute arrivals, then we'll dive right into today's topic. Okay, I think there's... Okay, thank you so much, Ruth. Ruth from our mother department, the Gauteng Department of Roads and Transport. Please, colleagues, do share your name, your organization that you're representing, and where you're joining us from. We would like to know. Okay, thank you so much, Jack, for that. Our technical team will ensure that the chat is open so that you are able to share those messages. So if you're experiencing any technical issues, please let us know on the Q&A at the moment. Then we'll attend to those while the chat box is still disabled. All right. Thank you so much, colleagues who have shared their names and organizations that they are joining, they are representing today. We are so happy to have you here today. I think we can now start in earnest. So once again, I would like to take this opportunity to welcome everyone to our July Knowledge Management webinar with ourselves, the Gautrain Management Agency, and our strategic partners, the Wits Business School. As I've indicated, we are so excited to have all you here today, and thank you for participating in our innovation called X Knowledge Share Session in partnership with Wits. These are part of our value proposition that we are putting forward as a GMA to the sector that we're operating in and to the knowledge fraternity at large. Today, we'll be looking at the topic of culture as it is influenced by knowledge management. Culture, as we know, it has got a multitude of aspects within it, but broadly it can be divided to material culture and non-material culture as two broad categories. And I found the material culture quite interesting as well because it refers to concrete, tangible things that man creates and use, and those things can range from prehistoric stone tools and that a primitive man used to use, all the way to the advanced computers that a modern man is using today. So it really fascinates me in that sense. Perhaps we can delve in detail when we look at knowledge management as it pertains to knowledge tools and technologies, and particularly the artificial intelligence as one of the fast-growing for IR technology. But today we'll want to take a detour and look at non-material culture that consists from simple things as like words that people use, habits they follow, ideas, custom, and behaviors that the society profess, and to which they strive to conform to laws, techniques, and way of life in a setting. And in this context, we're talking about in an organization. Hence, today we're looking at how knowledge management helped change culture at NASA. The webinar, as I've indicated earlier, is co-hosted by Gautrain Management Agency and the Wits Business School. But before we get started, I want to touch on some few formalities that I would like us to observe throughout the session. Please note that the session is recorded. If you are live tweeting, the 3 hashtags that you can use is Gautrain Journeys, White Matters, and hashtag Wits Business School. In terms of the evaluation, we will share the evaluation form at the end of the presentation. We'll also share the QR code. We'll also email it together with the slides. Due to the size of the webinar, please note that all of us were muted except the few individuals that will be making presentation. Please post your questions on the Q&A facility that is provided below. This facility is at the bottom. If you look at your screen, there's 3 dots. When you click there, it will appear. Please don't put your question on the chat function. We might miss them. Please know that we'll be taking questions. We won't be taking questions verbally. We will open a Q&A at the end. We'll try our best to answer all questions, but please bear with us. If we are unable to get into every single question due time, we'll also share an email whereby you can pop as your question, then we'll make sure that we get an answer for you. We're looking forward to an exciting conversation. Please also enjoy. I'll now take this opportunity to hand over to my executive manager, Ms. VM Gedezi, who will introduce our speaker today. But just before I hand over to him, I forgot to introduce myself at the beginning. I'm your host, Siviwe Bala, Senior Manager, Knowledge Management here at Gautrain Management Agency. Over to you, Siviwe.
Thank you very much, Ekama, for that lovely introduction. A very good afternoon to all the colleagues and good morning to Roger, who's joining us all the way from the US. He is our esteemed speaker for today. It is often said that it's attributed actually to Peter Drucker, but I don't think this is what he said. But it is an adage that we are all aware of, that it's often said that culture eats strategy for breakfast. And we thought that, with this knowledge about a culture that we have as organizations, it's important to then dig deeper into it and see how culture can be quite a useful strategic tool for growing knowledge management in our organizations. Our speaker is the former Chief Knowledge Officer at NASA. Roger started or worked for NASA rather for about 36 years. He's a very avid history and storyteller. I read some of his writings that he contributed to on the NASA page, and how he used history in his knowledge management and knowledge practice. He is an engineer. He's worked for that organization, as I said, for over 3 decades, and he is now retired. He's an author of 2 books. And I think we'll share those books at the end of this presentation. The one book is how um, the simpler ways of using knowledge management within a NASA context. I think my colleagues will share that. And he's got a very new book, actually, that says what happens now after graduation. And I think it's aimed at equipping those who are just straight out of college or straight out of university, and how they can use knowledge to enhance themselves and increase their efforts. Without further ado, Roger, we are very, very, very excited to be hosting you today, and we don't want to waste any more time because our seminar is scheduled, our webinar rather, is scheduled for an hour for today. I'm now going to hand over to you. Roger, welcome.
Thanks so much. And I'm excited to be here also. And let me get to my slides, share my screen with you. Okay. I take it you can see my slides okay?
Certainly we can see it, Roger. Thanks.
Great. I'd like to thank my friends at Gautrain and the Wits Business School for inviting me to present at this knowledge management webinar. I'm sure most of this group has a great deal of interest in knowledge management. So I'd like to share with all of you the story of how knowledge management got started at NASA, and especially how we use knowledge management to help change NASA's culture. Before we get started, I'd like to tell you a little bit about myself. I originally graduated from college with a bachelor's degree and a major in history. And at the time, I had some difficulty finding a rewarding career. So I decided to start all over, and I was hired by NASA as an apprentice mechanic. While working as a mechanic, I went to night school for 10 years, and I earned a bachelor's and then a master's degree in engineering. As a technician and later as an engineer, I worked on the space shuttle program, building and designing microgravity experiments. Later on in my career, I became involved with training and moved to NASA headquarters in Washington, D.C. in 2005. In 2015, I was selected as the NASA Chief Knowledge Officer and was also responsible for all project management and engineering training for the agency. I retired in 2021 after a very enjoyable and rewarding 38-year career at NASA. And for an engineer, a scientist, or a technician, NASA is a wonderful place to work. If you keep your eyes and your ears open, you can learn something new every single day. Since retiring, I wrote 2 books. The first one is Lean Knowledge Management, how NASA implemented a practical KM program, which is the basis for today's presentation. And also more recently, When Graduation's Over, Learning Begins, Lessons for STEM Students and Professionals. Now a little bit about NASA and why knowledge management has become important. We have an aging workforce, and we need to transfer that knowledge to a new generation of engineers and researchers. NASA currently employs approximately 18,000 civil servants. And when I retired 2 years ago, the average age was about 46. And I assume it's even older today. To put this in context, during the Apollo era, when NASA made the moon landings, the average age of the workforce was just 28. And today, the average age at SpaceX is just 29. NASA also employs approximately 60,000 contractors and has 10 field centers across the United States. For fiscal year 24, NASA's budget was about $24.9 billion. That represents about 0.5% of the total US federal budget. And to put that in context, during the heyday of the Apollo program, NASA's budget represented 4.4% of the total US budget. And today, I guess you can look at it as Americans spend more money on pizza or even dog food than they do on their space program. Here's what I hope to discuss today. I'd like to give you a brief history of CAM at NASA and why NASA decided knowledge management was a critical tool. And I'd also like to discuss how we developed a CAM program that would be practical and beneficial to the NASA workforce, something we called lean knowledge management. And then I'd like to show you how CAM helped change NASA's culture. And if you have any questions or comments during my presentation, please save them for the end, where we'll have a Q&A session. Most people are well aware of the many accomplishments NASA has had over the years, but many of these incredible technical feats have been at the cost of some tragic mistakes. NASA's mission to the moon was almost canceled in 1967 when 3 astronauts were burned to death during a test rehearsal of the Apollo 1 capsule on the launch pad. In April of 1990, the Hubble Space Telescope launched with a defective mirror and was only salvaged after astronauts risked their lives while in orbit and performed a special repair mission, costing well over $1 billion. In the late 1990s, both the Mars Climate Orbiter and the Mars Polar Lander were lost. One overshot the planet, while the other crash landed on Mars. The 2 worst disasters in our history were, of course, the losses of the space shuttles Challenger and Columbia. Many of you might not have been born yet, but anyone who was alive at the time remembers where they were when they first heard about the shuttle Challenger explosion. That morning, I was working as a mechanic at NASA, and someone walked by me and told me that there had been an accident during the launch. I simply didn't believe him. It just seemed impossible that an organization with the expertise and successes of NASA could lose a shuttle. But the shuttle Challenger accident shook NASA to its core. NASA managers had decided to launch the shuttle on a record cold morning in Florida, despite objections from NASA and contractor engineers. The result was a failure of one of the O-rings on the solid rocket motor that caused flames to escape and eventually ignite the main fuel tank. America and the world lost 7 extraordinary men and women that morning, and one of them was Crystal McCullough, the teacher in space. January 28, 1986 was the coldest morning temperature on record in Florida at 18 degrees Fahrenheit or -8 degrees Celsius. NASA's own procedures required a minimum of 40 degrees Fahrenheit or 4.5 degrees Celsius for a launch. NASA's managers had been warned for months that the O-ring joint had shown signs of failure on previous flights, and the O-rings were especially vulnerable when subjected to cold weather. Rather than wait until the afternoon when temperatures were expected to rise, NASA management decided to launch that morning from the ice-covered launch pad, despite objections from their own engineers. During their heated pre-launch meeting, one engineer was told to, quote, "take off your engineering hat and put on your management hat." President Reagan called for an investigation into the tragedy. Technically, it became obvious to everyone what happened. The brittle O-rings burst, causing the flames to ignite the external fuel tank. But there was much more to this tragedy. The Rogers Commission rightfully stated that the accident was a result of a decision-making process within NASA. And it was an accident rooted in history. It was rooted in NASA's past. One needs to understand NASA's history. NASA was conceived and developed during the Cold War to meet President Kennedy's incredibly difficult mandate of landing an American on the moon by the end of the decade. NASA had to become a so-called can-do type of organization. It followed the management style of the military, where you were told what to do and you were not expected to challenge your superiors. For me, one of the most compelling quotes about Challenger accident came from a young engineer named Bob Eberling. He was part of the team of contractors trying to convince NASA management not to launch on that cold morning. He never got over his inability to communicate his grave misgivings about launching, and for the rest of his life, he felt responsibility for the accident. Years later, Bob Eberling told a reporter, "I think that was one of the mistakes God made. He shouldn't have picked me for that job. Next time I talk to him, I'm going to ask him why me? You picked a loser." Bob Eberling passed away at 89 years of age in 2016 and is finally free of the guilt he felt over the Challenger accident. How did NASA handle the criticism of the Rogers Commission? NASA promised to make significant changes, but only superficial changes were made, and the debris from the Challenger was unceremoniously buried in an abandoned missile silo on Cape Canaveral Air Force Base with a huge concrete block covering it, effectively hiding their mistake. And note, burying your mistakes and failures is not how an organization shares knowledge. And unfortunately, it wasn't long before NASA went back to business as usual. 17 years later, NASA endured another tragedy when the Space Shuttle Columbia disintegrated above the skies of Texas during re-entry. Again, the world lost 7 extraordinary people. The accident report noted that NASA management had been aware for years of problems of foam coming off the main fuel tank during liftoff. In this case, a large chunk had hit the left wing 82 seconds after liftoff with a relative speed of over 500 miles per hour, striking the wing at its most vulnerable point, causing a massive hole. 16 days later, upon re-entry into the Earth's atmosphere, plasma formed within the damaged wing, causing vehicle destruction and the loss of crew. Another presidential commission was appointed, and they wrote a blistering report condemning NASA management and the decision process used to launch Columbia. And this time, NASA was forced to act. This time, Congress demanded action. The Columbia Accident Investigation Board, called the CABE report, stated that NASA's culture had never changed. It uncovered that for years, NASA managers were aware of previous foam strikes and continually ignored the warnings from engineers. This time, managers were fired and some reassigned. And rather than risk another tragedy, President George W. Bush decided to end the shuttle program. As a result of the Columbia accident, NASA implemented 2 significant changes: technical authority and dissenting opinion. The technical authority process ensures that technical experts representing engineering, safety, and health be included in any discussions about waivers or engineering changes. These technical experts need to be objective, so they are not funded by the projects they are investigating, but are independently funded by the agency. The second major change is called dissenting opinion, and this mandates that it is every project manager's ethical responsibility to speak up if they disagree with a decision or a process affecting health and safety. First, they are to approach the project manager. If after this discussion they still disagree, it moves to a higher management level and technical experts are brought in. If no agreement can be reached, it can go as far as my former boss, the NASA chief engineer, and it can go all the way to the NASA administrator if necessary. Although it took 2 heartbreaking tragedies, this time NASA learned from the past, and NASA's culture changed as a result. This is how NASA knowledge management is supposed to work, learning from failure. And I'm proud to be part of an organization that became determined to learn from the past and became stronger in doing so. Due to the far-reaching changes required by the CABE report, the Aerospace Safety Advisory Panel, the ASAP, was established by Congress to ensure NASA follow the recommendations of the CABE. The ASAP consists of leading figures within the aeronautics and space communities, such as retired aerospace business leaders and former astronauts. Its role is to evaluate NASA's safety performance and to issue a yearly report to Congress concerning NASA's compliance with the CABE report. In 2011, the ASAP recommended NASA appoint a Chief Knowledge Officer to enable the agency to learn from the past. They wrote in their report, NASA is good at gathering knowledge, but not good at disseminating it to its employees. And the ASAP tasked NASA with finding a way to share critical knowledge. For me, one of the most critical initial decisions made was that knowledge management would be given organizational respect. It was to be located in the office of the chief engineer. We all know for a project to succeed, it needs upper management support, and we achieved that right from the start. The agency's chief engineer is one of the most accountable positions within NASA, and answering to the chief engineer gave us the respect and access we needed to be successful. Given the ASAP's mandate, I set out to explore knowledge management. Despite attending lectures and reading numerous books, I came away somewhat confused. Everything I saw tended to make knowledge management much more complicated than I thought it needed to be. So as good engineers, we went back to the drawing board, and as good project managers, we reviewed and studied our requirements. NASA is a huge organization with a diverse group of operational and administrative roles. The critical first step was to define our audience. And for us, it became obvious we had to concentrate on the NASA technical workforce, the scientists, engineers, and technicians of the agency. And only after defining our audience could we determine what NASA's critical knowledge would be. Our team's purpose became, how can we make their job easier? What do you need? How can we help? We were also determined to keep it simple. NASA's technical workforce is a very complex and stressful job. Our researchers, engineers, and technicians don't have the time or the patience to deal with an esoteric knowledge management program. So we avoided academic jargon, and importantly, we developed a one-stop shop website, apple.nasa.gov, which I encourage all of you to check out. And finally, we integrated knowledge sharing with the training program by combining KM with our agency training program. We came up with what we called lean knowledge management. The most critical step we took was defining our audience. As I mentioned earlier, NASA has over 18,000 civil servants. Besides engineering, there's procurement departments, security, budget, legal, diplomatic affairs, infrastructure offices, etc. We just couldn't accommodate everyone. We had to decide who we were going to help. It became apparent that we needed to support the technical workforce, the men and women at NASA involved in designing, developing, and managing engineering programs and projects. Once our audience or customers were defined, we could focus on developing a KM program that would help them do their very difficult and complex jobs. We could now move to the three main phases involved in a knowledge management program. The first is to gather information. Then, from the mountain of endless information, we needed to filter the information that would be helpful to NASA's technical workforce and thus reveal our critical knowledge, which is also sometimes referred to as tacit knowledge. Once that was accomplished, we had to find the appropriate conduits to share this critical knowledge with our customers. We also implemented a federated structure among centers and directorates. We established knowledge offices at all NASA centers and directorates. And my role as the agency's chief knowledge officer was to ensure all our center directorates and offices collaborated and worked together. Okay, so once you've sorted through the mountains of information, you can now determine what is critical knowledge for your audience. And there are two types of knowledge. Explicit. This is knowledge that is transferable through media, such as procedures, databases, rules, and regulations. An example would be for a lessons learned database, or a NASA procedural requirement, an NPR, or an NPD, a NASA policy directive. And then there's tacit knowledge, which is expertise and knowledge primarily located within the brains of your employees. This is the important, crucial stuff, but it can be also very difficult to locate and share. So how do we do this? How do we transfer tacit knowledge to the people that need it? We combine KM with agency training. We develop coursework emphasizing learning from the past and including relevant case studies. We develop courses focused on critical thinking skills as well as cognitive bias and decision making. We conducted video interviews with leadership and practitioners, asking them what their best mistake was. What did they learn from their past mistakes as an engineer or a project manager? And for our younger audience, we developed podcasts with topics about learning from the past, as well as technical authority and dissenting opinion. And we developed a leadership mentorship program to ensure NASA's lessons from the past are passed down to a new generation of leaders. An example of how we share tacit knowledge was to develop a knowledge forum that would resonate with our audience. In an effort to never forget the difficult lessons of Apollo 1, Challenger, and Columbia, we implemented the Columbia Tour. Our knowledge office helped funds and support the Columbia Room at the Kennedy Space Center. Instead of burying Columbia's debris as the Challengers were, Columbia's debris was transferred to a giant room within the vehicle assembly building, where NASA employees can walk among the shuttle debris that was found scattered on the Texas prairie, and they can see the landing gear that is still dripping hydraulic fluid 20 years after the accident. They can see the windows the astronauts were looking out as they entered the atmosphere, and they can see some of the personal mementos each took aboard as they flew their final flight. I've been through the Columbia Room several times, and it's an incredibly sobering experience. It's almost like attending a wake or a funeral. But because not all NASA employees have the opportunity to visit the Columbia Room, we started the Columbia Agency Tour. We go out to each center and display some of the Columbia artifacts during a forum where we present speakers who played a role in the shuttle program and discuss the lessons they have learned from the tragedy. Some new hires at NASA may not have been even born or remember Challenger and Columbia, so we try to make a lasting mark on everyone at NASA. So these very difficult lessons are passed to another generation. Technical authority and dissenting opinion are also stressed throughout the Columbia Tour Forum. We try to present the facts leading up to the accidents, as well as the emotions of those employees and family members that lived through these tragedies. And this is in a hope that their experiences will make an indelible mark on our audience. At NASA, we found storytelling and case studies to be one of the most effective training and learning tools at our disposal. Being able to develop a real life story that your audience can relate to can be an incredibly learning experience for them. A well done case study places the reader in another person's shoes and forces them to think, what would I do in this situation? A well-written case study takes away the advantage of hindsight. It takes away the hubris. It makes one think, how am I different? What decision would I make with the same information? A case study causes the reader to perform self-reflection, and the experience lasts with them. People remember stories, especially ones that make an impression on them. I once sat in a meeting where one of the engineering managers involved with the Space Shuttle Columbia told the story of his experience after the accident. He lived in Houston, Texas, and personally knew the astronauts and their families, and his daughter went to the same school as one of the Columbia astronauts' children. When he came home the evening of the tragedy, his young daughter came up to him and said, "Daddy, did you kill my friend's father?" He recalled this experience with tears in his eyes, and it's a story I witnessed 10 years ago, but I will never forget. Storytelling can be that powerful. Feelings of emotions last much longer in a person's mind than facts and figures and data. There are numerous case studies available about both the Challenger and the Columbia accidents. Both these tragedies are not engineering case studies, but rather decision-making and management case studies, and are relevant for any audience, including Gautrain and the Wits School of Business. I found case studies to be such an advantage to learning that my second book, When Graduation's Over, Learning Begins, is a collection of pertinent and interesting case studies that I believe will resonate with any reader and help them learn some of the lessons I learned for my 38-year career at NASA. Knowledge management was a vital tool used to help transform NASA's culture after the Columbia tragedy. Notice I have the word helped italicized. I do not for 1 minute claim that knowledge management alone changed NASA's culture, but I do say that knowledge management was one of the critical tools used by upper management to implement the crucial and enormous changes needed for the agency. We did this by nurturing an environment of transparency and openness, and by creating a willingness to talk about failures and view them as an opportunity to learn rather than a reason to be punished. And by integrating technical authority and dissenting opinion into our training and knowledge events to ensure NASA employees never forget their core responsibilities. And finally, I'm not saying NASA's culture is perfect. For me, NASA was the best place in the world to work, but changing an organization that big is a continually evolving process. There are two quotes from the legendary flight director Gene Kranz that I think sum up the dichotomy concerning failure. If you watch Tom Hanks' movie Apollo 13, you'll recognize the first. Failure is not an option. But the second one Gene Kranz said is, there is no achievement without risk. For me, this summarizes the difficulties that NASA or any organization faces. We are basically told, you need to take risks to be successful, just don't fail. This is NASA and your own organization's challenge, but it's also knowledge management's opportunity. A robust knowledge management program that shares the lessons of the past can help guide a workforce to take risks, calculated risks, in order to create and innovate and be successful. A robust knowledge management program can help change a culture that punishes failure to one that learns from failure and becomes a better, stronger, more effective organization. And it's not really failing if you learn from it. Our own history as a species proves it. Evolution is simply a series of successful mistakes. We are all the result of a history of successful mistakes. One of the things that makes me most proud to have been a NASA employee is the agency's willingness to be transparent. NASA published those presidential reports that were so critical of its management style and decision-making process. NASA hung its dirty laundry out for all the world to see. But by doing so, NASA showed the world that it was able to take responsibility and learn from its mistakes. NASA changed and became a stronger agency. And after all, isn't that what lessons learned and knowledge sharing are all about? Learning from the past and changing a culture for the better. Lean knowledge management played a key role in helping to transform NASA's culture, but it can do a lot more to help any organization become more effective. Knowledge management can help reduce mistakes and failures by studying the source of a problem and fixing it so it doesn't happen again. KM develops a sense of transparency within an organization where people feel they are part of a program and that their organization isn't looking to punish mistakes, but wants to collaborate and hear from them to improve processes. KM could and should be used by upper management to relay the needs and concerns of the organization by engaging in town halls, podcasts, or video conferences, by sharing knowledge. Most importantly, your organization's knowledge is free. It's out there on the shop floor, it's in the accounting office, the legal office, the sales office, it's in every one of your employees. You need to get out there and capture it before they retire or move to a different organization and share their and your knowledge with a competitor. Before I finish, I'd like to give you a quick update on NASA's current knowledge management efforts. Despite the disruptions from the pandemic and work from anywhere, NASA has maintained a strong KM program. NASA management still demonstrates the importance of knowledge management as CKO, and training still resides within the Office of the Chief Engineer. There is still a strong effort to retain the tacit knowledge of retiring workforce by conducting interviews, documenting project experiences with case studies, and hosting subject matter experts on podcasts. The Chief Knowledge Officer is closely aligned and sharing resources with the NASA History Office, which is a gold mine of critical knowledge. And again, I highly recommend you visit their website, apple.nasa.gov, where you can find a treasure trove of both explicit and tacit knowledge. The website is open to anyone in the world. There's no firewall preventing access to NASA's knowledge. Through effective knowledge management, we have helped NASA develop an attitude and a culture of openness and transparency. Again, I want to thank the Gautrain Management and Wits Business School for inviting me to share our Lean KM program with your group. It's been a real pleasure, and I hope you come away with an appreciation of lean knowledge management and how we made it work at NASA. And I'd be happy to answer any questions you may have. And I've also included my email address if there's anything you want to discuss offline.
Thank you very much, Roger, for that insightful presentation. I see that there are questions. I want to invite colleagues to please put their questions on the chat. Thank you very much to Goodwill, who has thanked Roger for his presentation. I just want to run through to say thank you to all the attendees. We have got quite a number of colleagues from the different Roger, entities of the public sector in South Africa. So we've got the various departments of public service. We will share the email Refumo in a second. The Department of Public Service and Administration. I think we also have the different municipalities that have joined us here today. We have got the roads agencies, the Joburg Roads Agency, universities, Rhodes University is here. Thank you for joining us. SAQA, the South African Qualifications Authority is also here. The Department of Public Works, the Department of Small Businesses is also represented. NEMISA is also represented. SASOL, one of our oil companies, is also represented. And CESA, our flagship research innovation institution in South Africa. To mention, but if you, Bridget, yes, of course, I see CEDA is also represented. Thank you very much for that, Bridget. So Roger, so we have a diverse group of colleagues on the line, and I think that the questions are going to be centered around the use of knowledge management in the public sector space and how you can advise in terms of doing that. But let me start off with the first question that I see on the Q&A, just to remind the colleagues that you can post your questions on the Q&A so that we don't miss any of the questions that you have for us, and then we can answer them straight away. Let me start with Refumo. So Refumo is I won't go through everything that you've written over there, Refumo. We will share that narrative with Roger. But in a nutshell, Roger, Refumo is starting his own or her own space agency. It's called L-Space Telecoms, and the aim is to launch micro starships. And he or she has written quite a narrative there. What I'm going to propose here is if Roger, you can perhaps be open to engaging, the question with Refumo offline and how to start the spaceship agency. Roger has shared his email address. I'm going to ask my colleague Refumo to share Roger's email address again. I see they've done that. It's over there, Roger. If you can just confirm, you'll be happy to just engage with Refumo in terms of starting their own space agency.
I'd be more than
okay, cool. All right. Thank you so much for that. Our host, Mr. Bala, had indicated, colleagues, that he will be sharing the slides, so you don't have to worry. The session is recorded, so the recording will be shared with all of you as our attendees, together with the slides, because Roger has generously agreed to share his slides with us. So you will receive a copy of the slides. Keanu, to get a copy of the book, I think it's available on Amazon. I'm going to ask my colleagues to share the link. I think also on Take a Look, the book is available in South Africa. I want to ask my colleague to share the link where you can purchase the book, Keanu, so that you can be able to buy. Roger, is your latest book available on sale already?
Yes, yeah, it's also available on Amazon.
Okay, all right. So we'll just put both those links over there. Keanu wants to learn a little bit more. As I said, Roger, it's about the public sector. He wants to learn more about strategic knowledge management for enhancing public infrastructure projects delivery. I suppose, how can one use knowledge management more strategically in enhancing the work of building public infrastructure, be it roads, be it houses, and so on? While I look for the other questions, perhaps, Roger, you can speak on that.
Sure. Yeah, that's a good question. And you know, in reality, NASA is a public, you know, organization. It's government owned. It's not out there to make a profit. And I agree with the assumption of the question that there is a difference between public works and also private industry. I think private industry utilizes knowledge management primarily as a way to save money, save on costs. You know, failures in an auto industry on safety or something like that can end up costing an auto company, you know, millions of dollars in recalls or lawsuits and things like that. So I think private industry views knowledge management more as a tool to you know, save money and protect the bottom line. Whereas public, I think, you know, and what we did at NASA, we're not out to make money, but the keys that knowledge management brings is that your customers are the public that you serve, the people that pay the taxes. And what you don't want to do is have a huge failure and become a, you know, where the newspapers and public in general is looking at how you do your processes and how you do your business. I think knowledge management is a excellent tool for any public organization to help make sure that they're doing their work correctly, that they are it also kind of demonstrates to the public that you're being transparent and that you're also working to improve the services to the public.
Yeah. Okay. Thank you so much, Roger. I hope that you answered the Keanu. There's a question also, Roger, from Rita Prinsloo. So Rita is asking, how did you make it simple? I suppose the knowledge program at NASA, was it just limited perhaps to the different knowledge products for different audiences? I think maybe Rita wants to learn a little bit more, share a little bit more about how you made it simple in what, in our view, would seem like such a complicated and highly technical environment.
That's a great question, and I can you know, just relate my experience when I was named Chief Knowledge Officer and I started doing research on knowledge management and what it really was, and I was going to numerous forums and dealing with going to universities and reading books produced by university professors, and I just thought it was just way too theoretical. It just seemed to be, and I understand, you know, the universities do important work researching knowledge management, but it wasn't really the kind of tool that would help the NASA technical workforce. They weren't interested in the theory about knowledge management. They were interested in ways I can help them do their job. And that was by, you know, sorting through the vast amounts of information that's out there and determining what is really, you know, important knowledge, tacit knowledge that's going to help my workforce, and the stuff that is just kind of superfluous and that superfluous to my technical workforce. It might be important to somebody else in accounting or somebody else in foreign affairs or things like that. But I was simply, we made it simple because we concentrated on one group of people that we considered to be the most significant people at NASA that needed help, and that was the technical workforce. So we just kind of filtered everybody else out and everybody else's information out. We didn't ignore them. If somebody in the IT wanted to be part of the knowledge management program, we told them, you know, we're not focusing on that, but we'd be more than happy to help you develop your own knowledge management program for IT folks. And it becomes a lot more manageable rather than trying to please everybody. You just focus on your audience. And for us, that was the technical workforce.
Okay. Thank you, Roger. Aretha, I hope you answered there. I think the book by Roger, lean and knowledge management shown on the screen at the moment does give some really good nuggets in terms of how do you tailor make your programs for the audiences that you need to serve as the knowledge management team. And you would know that in a municipality, you've got different departments, so different units that you need to cater for. But I think the book can be quite a useful tool in that regard. There is more questions, Roger. Let me start with the question from our colleague, a fellow engineer there with Roger, is Mr. Makatini Nati, is asking as to whether NASA is totally insulated and autonomous as an organization and insulated from political influence, and whether it's reporting to the National Department of Transport or a different department within the US government.
You know, of all the government agencies, I think NASA is about the most autonomous. Now, it's not totally autonomous. It answers to Congress, and but it's one of the agencies within the U.S. government that gets a lot of bipartisan support, and that's not easy to do these days. You know, there's always a fight about whether too much money is spent on the Department of Defense or you know, every other agency. But I think, and especially within the last 10 years or so, when it was decided to go back to the moon, I think both parties have been supportive of that. And I think that's really critical to NASA's success. They don't have to, you know, every time there's a new president, they don't have to worry about getting their budget slashed drastically or ending huge programs. It's, like I said, for the past decade or so, both parties have been pretty supportive. And I think that's been a real key to NASA's success.
Okay, you said something interesting when you started off, Roger. You were saying that the budget of NASA is something to the effect of uh, what people spend on pizza or what they spend on their pet food. What was that about? Is that what was the is the budget lower over the years, or are you feeling that there should be more actually being spent in that type of work?
No, I think that I just put that bullet point in there to put it in context that during the moon landings in the Apollo in the 1960s, the U.S. government spent an enormous amount of money on NASA, and at that time, I think we reflected almost 4.5% of the U.S. government budget. And I think NASA is appropriately funded now. I think they, from my experience, I think they manage their funding properly. I think they utilize it properly, and I think, you know, every organization can always claim they want more money, but I think, you know, I think sure if you had the administrator of NASA here, he'd say they need more money. But I think if you look for their accomplishments and how they spend their money, I think currently they're doing a real good job, and I think they're being funded appropriately.
All right. No, thank you for that, Roger. We have much more questions. I'm going to try to get to these colleagues as quick as I can. Bridget is saying that KM is often an under-resourced function within organization in as far as human capacity and budget is concerned, relating back to what we were speaking about earlier. How are you resourced at NASA? I think you partly answered it, but maybe in a nutshell, would you say compared to other knowledge management units in other organizations, did you receive much more budgetary support at NASA, in your view?
Yeah, I was very happy with the support I got from NASA management and from the NASA workforce. And I think one of the advantages I had on developing our knowledge management program was that I was dealing with technical people and engineers. And I think, especially in an organization like NASA that is widely known throughout the world, nobody wants to make a big mistake.
Yeah.
And they appreciate the learning from the past. And I think engineers in general have a kind of innate interest in learning how things, you know, how things work, and also how accidents happen. And I think understanding that, that's one of the reasons why we developed so many case studies, because we knew our audience, our technical workforce, would find that interesting. You know,
Yeah.
troubleshooting, you know, why things don't work the way they're designed.
Okay. Thank you, Roger. I'm going to go back to this issue of failure. I see Peter Lecky has asked, but before Peter Lecky, let me allow Jacques' question to come through. Jacques is asking, in fact, he's referring to the very powerful quote you made in your presentation, that take off your engineering hat and put on your management hat. This is related to those tragedies that happened that related to management decisions. Jacques' question is, how do you deal with the bureaucracy? And
Yeah.
how do you deal with the management, you know, expectation to take or make those tough choices regardless of what the implications will be?
That's a great question, and you know, that gets to the whole crux of the Challenger accident. And you know, when you're in a meeting and your boss tells you, yeah, basically, I disagree with you and you're going to change your mind, it takes a lot of nerve and a lot of strength to stand up to them and say that. And uh, and I think that's really why I love case studies, is because I think normally you would think, oh, I would stand up and I'd say, no, you know, you should never launch, and I'm not gonna agree with this. But most people, you know, if they're put in that situation where their boss is staring them down and telling them, you know, your job's on the line if you don't agree with me, that makes you really, it hits to your core. It makes you really want to, you know, self-reflect and think, do I have the courage to stand up in a situation like that? And I think that's to me, that's the real benefit and the beauty of case studies. I can tell you honestly, I've never been in that situation, and I'm thankful I never have been. It scares the heck out of me to think I ever would be. But I also think by sharing that, you know, especially that quote, and that you know, take off your engineering hat, put on your management hat, and that whole case study about Challenger, sharing that with upper management at NASA or upper management anywhere, would also make them self-reflect and think, wow, is this really the way I want to manage? Look what happened, you know, to the manager at NASA during the Challenger disaster, when he forced his engineers to go against their gut and go against their data and make a bad decision. I think, you know, both sides need to understand case studies like that.
Thanks, Roger. Let me just paraphrase the question from Peter Lecky. Peter was saying that, how do you change this culture and allow failure, and most importantly, learning from this failure? Surely it doesn't need tragedy, and I think we've also seen examples of that in South Africa. In an environment where failure is not encouraged, how do you, you know, it's not the norm. What advice would you give to the professionals sitting in this webinar, Roger, in terms of allowing failure in organizations and learning from your one of your quotes earlier? You were saying that bearing failure is not how we learn as organizations, and that's what you said. So would you like to just give us some thoughts there?
Sure. And well, your group sure asked some tough questions. You know,
This
there is.
late in the evening in South Africa. Eh?
I wish there were an answer I could give you that would directly change an agency's culture, but we all know agencies are big and they're diverse and they go in different directions, and trying to change the culture can be agonizingly slow. And you know, what I try to detail in the book and in this discussion we had today is that with NASA's, it took two heartbreaking tragedies in order for NASA upper management to wake up and understand that the way that they were managing in the past was not the right way to do it. I think one of the critical ways would be to, you know, start with upper management and see if they can understand. I actually had a conversation with somebody, a recent webinar I had about my book, and this person said that they purchased my book and gave it to their management to read, and he said that it kind of opened their eyes. It kind of made them think, you know, that culture is important, and made them kind of reflect and make sure that the culture that they were developing was the right kind of culture. You know, you want to avoid failure at all costs, but is punishing failure going to help? Certainly, if somebody continually fails or you know, purposely fails, the punishment would be called for. But when you're in a research organization, or when you're trying your best and failure inevitably happens, rather than punish, you know, I think the smartest thing to do is to study why the process failed, or why the you know, why you had this core issue in the first place, and try to manage it that way, rather than just take a otherwise good employee and you know, punish them. There's, what's really interesting at NASA is when we have webinars and forums, and we've invited our upper management, and the questions we asked them was to discuss, you know, through their career, what did they learn from their mistakes in the past. And I think that kind of opened people's eyes in the audience, thinking, you know, yeah, I make mistakes, but so did this renowned project manager at NASA talk about his or her mistakes in the past. And people realize that these things are unfortunate and they happen, but it's not bad if something good results from it. If you learn something from the past, then, you know, a mistake or a failure isn't really earth-shattering or bad. It can actually be a help.
Yeah. Colleagues, we are running a little bit over time, so I'm going to summarize some of the questions, but I will get to all of them. For instance, Mbuso was asking, why is it so important that any organization or entity to have knowledge management? I think we've partly answered Mbuso this question, because every single time you repeat mistakes at an organization, it means you have to spend the money redoing projects that you could have perhaps not spent as much had you kept the knowledge or preserved the knowledge in the first place. And there is a question from Spetile. So Spetile, you were answering this question partly, Roger, but I do want to put it to you, because Spetile is saying that in a multidisciplinary scientific organization, achieving convergence across all science domains can be challenging. I imagine this is a research institution or a university, or, you know, a private institution, despite the fact that there's opportunity to do the knowledge sharing, the storytelling. Still, you know, there are those competing interests. And I think Roger had mentioned that you need to cater, define who the client is, decide what is it that is useful, you know, for that client. How is the work of the client made easier? So Roger, do you want to maybe speak on that? If you have these multidisciplinary units within one organization, how do you create that convergence? Maybe in a word or two, because there's a list of questions literally as I look through my screen.
I mean, hopefully I understand the question correctly, but
Mm.
in a research organization like NASA or a university, you're going to have different departments and that have different responsibilities. And I thought no matter how big they made my budget, I couldn't. I was an engineer. I was a technician, and I had done that my whole career at NASA. So I knew that field, and I knew some of the difficulties and the problems of being a technician and an engineer. I don't know what it's like to be in procurement or accounting or legal. And I wouldn't do a good job being a knowledge manager or including knowledge management from those various departments. But at the same time, I think we set up a really good infrastructure of knowledge management for the technical workforce. And I was more than willing and more than happy to share that with other organizations if they too wanted to develop their own knowledge management program. And we encouraged other organizations to do it. I mean, the beauty of knowledge management is that it's free. Yeah, I mean, you know, you've already paid for it. Your employees are, you know, over the years have gained this tacit knowledge, the stuff that nobody else knows. They know how to do sales. They know how to do certain procedures. They know how to do things on an assembly line that nobody else in the world knows. And all you need to do is go out there and interview them or talk to them or work with them and gather that knowledge, gather it before you lose it. And I think that's one of the scary things at NASA, that they realize that their workforce is getting old, and they have these new projects government wants them to go back to the moon and put a permanent presence on the moon. How are we going to do that? All the Apollo guys are gone. They're all retired. You know, why do we have to learn all this information all over again when we, 10 years ago we had it? So, and I think, and I also, when you're talking to knowledge management about developing a knowledge management program, I think that's one of the best angles to take, is that relate to them. You already paid for this. It's sitting out there and it's for free. All we have to do is gather it. You lose it, you got to pay for it all over again. Actually, I had an interesting experience with a manufacturer in the United States that builds jet engines. And I asked them, exactly how do they were developing a knowledge management program. And this person wanted to know, how we deal with retirees. I told them, we would try to interview them. We try to work with them for, at least, years before they start to retire. And I asked him how his company does it. And he said they don't do anything. He said what ends up happening is somebody with key knowledge ends up retiring, and then we end up having to hire the person back at double the salary to come back and do the same job that they were doing. And I see that all the time in a lot of companies.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think this is very much related to the question that Itumeleng was asking, in terms of in South Africa, especially state-owned companies, making a mistake is not publicly encouraged. Actually, it's not allowed at all. And I think that Itumeleng Roger dealt with the issue of transparency at NASA, allowed NASA to actually achieve its goals and not hiding things under the carpet. So the question was that, was there any policy clause or specific processes that effectively manage and encourage learning from mistakes? I think the presidents at the time made that declaration. I think you said, Roger, it was President Bush who made that determination, because it meant that more tragedies would happen if knowledge is not managed properly at NASA. Then the other question was from Bali. How easy was it to introduce KM within a technical workforce team? Bali, I think we've dealt with this one already. And then how do you balance a risk averse versus risk taking in decision making? Do you want to tackle this one, Roger? Because I think it's related to, managers didn't listen at NASA to the advice from the engineering teams, because they just, wanted to deliver, I suppose, the project, not necessarily looking at what are the what will be the consequences of not learning from the past mistakes. In a knowledge management context, between being risk averse and risk taking in decision making, what would be your stance there?
Again, that's a question. I can't give you a direct answer. It's complicated.
Yes.
Involves human beings and the way we think and the way we act and the way we're managed. I think risk aversion is part of culture. I think if if you're worried you're going to get punished, you're going to be you're going to be risk averse. You're not going to be willing to take the kind of risks that could end up being successful and being creative and innovative. And I guess trying to make people understand that you don't get innovation without taking risks, and you don't get creativity without taking risks. And sure, sometimes that risk isn't going to pay off, but when it does, it pays off big time.
I think your question is answered there. I think it was Sovo. You were asking whether does knowledge management hamper innovation? From what Roger has said now, certainly not. In fact, knowledge management, I think, is an enabler of innovation in organizations. The last two questions, and I close the Q&A on my end and thank the colleagues. It's how big was the team at NASA when you were the chief knowledge officer, Roger? And now that you've retired, how did you transfer the knowledge to the younger teams? And more importantly, I think your your next in line, the chief knowledge officer who's in charge at the moment?
Yeah, that's a great question. And that's one I can actually answer. I had a team, we had about a dozen people. They were all contractors. They were great. They loved NASA. Matter of fact, like I said, they were contractors, but if anybody asked them who they worked for, they'd always say NASA. They were so proud to work at NASA. We had we were not only knowledge management, but we were training. So we were well known throughout the agency and well respected throughout the agency. And when I retired, the chief engineer posted my job and put me on the committee that would interview people that would take, who would succeed me. And we probably, interviewed at least a half dozen, about probably 10 people. And I think we came up with somebody that was in the Aeronautics Directorate and had been the knowledge officer for the Aeronautics. So she was very familiar with NASA and familiar with how we did knowledge management and training. And they brought her on board. Unfortunately, it was during COVID, so we didn't have much time for face to face. But we did have numerous discussions by Teams, Microsoft Teams, and turning it over to somebody that was familiar with me and familiar with the current program that we developed was a little bit, obviously a lot easier than turning it over to somebody who was unfamiliar with NASA or unfamiliar with how we did knowledge management. And I still keep in touch with her. She's doing a great job. She's pretty much following the same way that we're doing now. But I really recommend if you get a chance to go on apple.nasa.gov and you'll see everything that we were able to offer to the net technical workforce.
Yeah, thank you so much, Roger. Colleagues, I have posted on the chat to everyone the link to the NASA website on knowledge, the NASA knowledge repository, apple.nasa.gov. Roger's email address has been shared with you. If you would like to get in touch with him, you're more than welcome to do that. Thank you very much for all the questions that you've asked us, and I hope that we were able to answer them. I do take away a lot of lessons and insights from you, Roger, as always, and very powerful statements we've made here today that make us think as public sector officials and also as colleagues and knowledge practitioners, that one of the lessons for NASA was that transparency, hanging out to dirty laundry, actually made you learn quite a lot. I'm going to hand over back to the host. We are really behind schedule. I'm going to hand over to the host, and the host can do his concluding remarks. Thank you very much, colleagues. Mr. Bala.
Thank you so much, Susie. Well, I'm still taken by one of the statements that Roger made to say evolution is simply a series of successful mistakes. It's so interesting how NASA embraced learning from failure. So as I'm making my concluding remarks, I'm sure colleagues would agree with me that there's a lot of lessons that we can take away from this session. I won't do it justice, even if I try to begin to mention what I have from my side, but I'll take that opportunity. One of them being embracing failure as an organization, given the fact that it's prevalent that in many organizations they tend to adopt this sweep it under the carpet culture, but it's so interesting how NASA, embrace failure and how it has contributed to its knowledge to their knowledge management program. So I think for me that is one major takeaway, obviously coupled with other key practices of ensuring that the location of the knowledge management function is placed correctly within the organization structure. I guess that's the reason why knowledge management program at NASA enjoyed support, particularly in terms of budgetary resources and from the leadership. So it's very important to ensure that it is placed correctly. Obviously, issues such as defining your audience, keeping it simple and not get carried away with the textbook theory, combine knowledge management with training to ensure that things like onboarding are much more efficient and effective. Leadership and mentorship. I would have loved, Roger, if you could explain how can we best approach the leadership and mentorship program, considering that most of the principals are usually attending meetings, busy, and even in this outside organization, you'd find that when there's call for mentors, there's usually a large number of mentees than people who are available to actually do the mentoring. Building relatable stories, storytelling, case studies, you know, and one of the lessons that I've also underscored was the fact that you at NASA noticed that you were good at gathering, but not so good with sharing. And that's one other thing that we usually do as knowledge practitioners. It's easy to collect presentation, reports, documents, and so on, but sharing them is usually a challenge sometimes. But one lesson that takes the cake for me is embracing of failure, given the fact that even the inventor of the bulb, Thomas Edison, I think he had 1,000 unsuccessful attempts before he created the light bulb. So it is important to persist and embrace failure. So with that being said, I would like to take this opportunity to extend our heartfelt appreciation to you, Roger, for taking time to share your pearls of wisdom with us. Also, thank everyone who attended today's session. I know you could have been anywhere, considering that it's after work, but you chose to be with us. And thanks to the team that made this webinar successful, and to our strategic partners at Wits Business School. Thank you so much. Colleagues, we would love to hear from your feedback on this webinar. The link for the evaluation form will be shared. Also, the QR code that was shared on the screen, you can also access the feedback. Yes, the one that is currently being on the screen. So we would love to hear from you. Keep an eye on LinkedIn and other social media platforms for more updates and for further engagement. The recording of the webinar will also be available via Gautrain social media. So with that being said, colleagues, I would like to thank everyone and thank our principals who were with us today, our CFO and acting COO. Would like to really acknowledge your presence here today. With those few words, colleagues, I will say goodbye. Thank you again for joining us. What a great conversation indeed. We hope to see you again soon and have a great evening further. Thank you.